Hello and welcome to LabRide. Today I'm going to show you how to make a hood like this that will go well with the Rana cloak that I made a few weeks back, or it can be worn on its own. Really, if you want to, you can attach the hood to the cloak, no problem, but I like it to have it as a separate piece. For one thing, I can wear the cloak without the hood, or the hood without the cloak, but also this gives an additional layer of protection against the rain over my shoulders, which I appreciate. Some design features of this got an inner lining, so it's comfortable against my skin. If I were just to wear the raw wool on my skin, it can become itchy on the face and on the head, especially if you are sweating. And like this, it's nice and comfortable. And also, I've added some buttons to the front, so I can take this easily off and on. But if it's becoming windy, if the weather's becoming really bad, windy, then I can button up, close the front, and like this, not only is my neck protected, my throat protected from the wind, but also the cloak, the hood, doesn't come off easily on its own, which has been a problem on windy days on previous hoods that I made. So, if this is something that interests you, like and subscribe, and I'll show you exactly how I made this. Starting as always with the fabric, and this is the same thin linen fabric I've used for my simple tunic, my under tunic, and this will also work well for the lining of the hood or any other lining for that matter. And to start with, I'm measuring, trying out and making the pattern right on the fabric here. You could use paper at this point, then staple it together and try it on, but I have a lot of this thin linen laying around and I wanted to skip the paper phase, so I'm trying things out right here on the fabric until I came up with this pattern. I have to admit this is not the most beautiful pattern ever put to paper. The basic concept here is that you have to make the hood fit onto your head. If it is too large, it will just fall into your face and you won't be able to see anything. If it's too small, it won't fit at all. And if it ain't got the right shape, it will shift around on your head and you will have to correct often, which are all problems I had with hoods in the past, especially the too big part. And I used to have a hood with a long trailing end that was fashionable at some time in the Middle Ages, but that really shifted onto my face way too often, so I shortened the whole thing to a hood that wouldn't cover my whole face when it shifted forward. And for what it's worth, the pattern I've made fits really well. It's looking a bit funny, I think. Maybe I'll change the front of the collar up a bit, but in general this is a good place to start. So this is my first try and I'm using safety pins to pin it all together and then try it on. see how it fits. And it's not a bad start, but I wanted to be able to close this up front, and for that it is too short in the front. So I made another version that is a bit longer in the front, and this one fits as intended. So this is the pattern I have used going forward with this build. This is the leftover wool from the Rana cloak, so 100% thick warm felted wool. And sheep's wool is naturally weather resistant. There's sheep's fat in there, sheep's wax, so-called lanolin. You can buy this washed out of wool, but in this felted wool there should be plenty of it left. And if it turns out not to be weatherproof enough, I will try refatting it or using some commercial weatherproofing spray on the hood. For now, I'll try it as it is. I've laid this out in a double layer and copied the pattern that is already in the thin linen onto it. That will be the outer hood, the linen will be the lining, the inner hood. And now I'm looking how much I have got left to do the shoulder part. This is very much a project I made from leftover material. So I couldn't make the shoulder part as large as I had wanted to. I would have added maybe 10 centimeters. But it didn't turn out too short, I think. But if there's one thing you can take away from this is how to make do with the material you've got and make things from some scrap fabric laying around. Usually rest of a length of fabric like this is still good enough to make a hood or bag from it. What I've done here, I've folded it in a way that I can make a quarter circle, and it will turn out into 2 half circles. Also, it's way easier to make a quarter circle than a full circle, and this way it's nice and symmetric. And after doing a little bit of math, I have figured out the radius of the circle with the circumference of my head of 62 centimeters, and it's about 13. So I've once again folded this in a way that I've got 4 layers, so I can make a quarter circle in the middle, and then it will become a complete circle in the middle, and this is where I'll sew the rest of the hood to. You could also sew the hood into the head opening of a Rana cloak or any other cloak, but this is what I'll do for a standalone cloak. Let's go to the sewing machine. When I cut this out, when I measured this, the bottom of the hood fit the circumference of the head opening of the circle, but when sewing this together it didn't really fit anymore because of the way I had to sew it together, meaning in the front there's a gap. If you don't want this, you can cut out the leftover material in the front and the hood will fit better because of this. Actually, after the making of this video. That's how I have modified my own hood. And I'm going with a simple linear stitch, and then I'm zigzagging and hemming in the edges so it won't become undone. Not really necessary with this felted wool, but I thought better safe than sorry. And I've also managed to sew this in the wrong way. These have to mirror each other, these two pieces. So I had to undo all of my stitches and was regretting that I zigzagged it, and then had to sew it together again, this time the right way. And after the left and the right hood part are sewn to the left and the right shoulder part, I'm sewing the two of them together. Make sure they fit together as intended. Make sure all your seams are on the same side. And just as before, simple linear stitch followed by zigzagging over the edges to hem them in. To sew together the inner lining, I use the same brown thread because I didn't really care. You could sew this together with thread matching the color of the fabric, but you have to sew it to the outer wool, the outer layer eventually, and you don't want to use a bright thread for that. You want to use the brown thread that matches the wool, so I saw no point in changing this around. And just as I did with the linen for the simple tuning, I'm folding the edges over twice and sew them closed with a simple linear stitch, hemming all of the edges in to keep them from unraveling. Beware, this made the inner hood slightly smaller than the outer hood, so I'm starting at the top in the middle to sew the inner lining in, and I'm just sewing it in on the outer edges and securing it at one point in the back. Maybe I do more stitches in the future to improve it, but for now I thought this is more than enough. But this way it's symmetrically too short on all sides, but it's still large enough to do what it is supposed to do, and keep the itchy wool from touching my face directly. And if you don't want to sew in the buttons and go through the hassle of that, you could call the project finished right here. But I wanted to do a few buttons to be able to close it in the front. And also didn't have any buttons lying around, so I'm cutting some from the thickest scrap leather lying around. Almost any leather scraps are still big enough to make buttons from. And that's really simple. Cut them to shape, punch, 2, 3 or 4 holes into them. And then I'm using some oil dye to make them brown all around, and you could polish the edges, maybe sand it to be even rounder, maybe make the 2 buttons look more the same, but I didn't care. I think this is good enough. After these buttons have dried overnight, it's time to mark where they're going. So I'm marking where to sew them on and where to punch some holes for the buttons to go through. And the way I do it, I zigzag around the holes that I am going to cut out for the buttons. First, this makes it easier to do the zigzag and make sure the sole doesn't become bigger and bigger as you use it. I'm using avoid this zigzag pattern. I'm going back and forth a few times around the hole and then cut it open in the center. Then it's time to sew on the buttons, and I have to do this by hand. I can't do this with my sewing machine, especially not on custom one-of-a-kind buttons like these. So get out your sewing needle, and what I like to do, I sew with a double length, and I do a knot at the back holding it together so it won't pull through. And using a double length means that I'm doing actually 2 stitches in one, and with the leftover length I can in the end secure the stitches with a double knot. And you saw I started there not by sewing on the buttons, but actually sewing together a cut that was in front of the hood. Since this is basically made from scrap material, at some point I must have cut in there where there was not supposed to be a cut. So I have fixed that by hand. And I'll leave a link to my video how to age clothes. If you're doing this for LARP character, having a brand new hood might not be in character and you want to make it old and used. You can see after I've sewn this on a few times, I go around between the button and the fabric, so there's a protective layer around the actual stitches. Then I secure it. And this finishes the build. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.